Did you know that if you're an American citizen, you don't vote directly for the President of the United States? In fact, you don't even have the right to vote for president at all. We'll talk about that when we talk about the Electoral College, timely subject, on this edition of Prose and Con Law. Hi, I'm John O'Connor, and thanks for tuning in to this episode of Prose and Con Law. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you to please subscribe to our YouTube channel or subscribe to our podcast on iTunes or wherever podcasts are found. And please leave a comment or a question if you have specific questions about what we should do for upcoming episodes. You can email us at proseandconlaw@gmail.com or message us on Twitter at proseandconlaw. Today we're going to look at the Electoral College with the 2020 election happening next week in the United States of America. A lot of people have questions about what the Electoral College is, what it does, and why we don't get rid of it. So to answer the simple questions first, the Electoral College is the group of people who gather every 4 years to actually vote for President of the United States. There are 538 electors spread out across the 50 states and the District of Columbia. Each state gets at least 3 electors, while the largest state in terms of population, California, gets 55. The number of electors for each state is determined by the number of congresspeople each state has. So the minimum number of congresspeople each state can have is 3, which is 2 senators and 1 congressperson who can represent the entire state. States like this include Wyoming, South Dakota, North Dakota, and Alaska. Obviously, again, the largest one is California, who also has 2 senators, but then has 53 representatives in the House of Representatives. Every 4 years, each state's electors will meet in the Capitol to actually cast votes for the presidency. Those votes are then sent to Washington, D.C., where the head of the Senate, the vice president, will open up all the ballots, count them, and declare the winner based on who has the majority of those electoral votes, which is 270, being half of 538. So that's what the Electoral College is. 538 people who meet every 4 years, who are chosen usually by the parties in their individual states, and they meet at the state capitol to decide on who the president and vice president will be. So why do we have this particular strange institution? A large part of that is because the writers of the Constitution were very skeptical about direct participation in government, what people would call direct democracy, small d, not the Democratic Party. And they were skeptical for a few reasons. The framers of the Constitution recognized how large the country they were setting up was. It took literally months to get from one place to another, where today it would take maybe a half hour to an hour. There were no roads, there was no industrialization, certainly. There were no cars. This was all by horseback, or if you're lucky, horse and carriage on a dirt road. So to get from New Hampshire to Washington, D.C. was a journey that could take months. So how would the electorate, the people, actually know who would be the best president going forward? Certainly, I think all the writers of the Constitution, and frankly, people in the United States at the time, assumed that George Washington would make a good president. But after that, how would they know who was the best person to vote for? And so the compromise that came up was to have this selection of people who could be chosen by the electorate, but then who would go to their state capitals, have a discussion, and select who they thought would be the best person for the job. And presumably these electors would be trusted people, figures in the community, as opposed to the standard elector. Remember, the framers of the Constitution also didn't really believe in party democracy. They were hopeful that parties would not form. Now, bear in mind also, by the way, that in the event that there is no majority in the Electoral College, the vote would then go to the House of Representatives and the Senate for the president and the vice president, and then that's how the top candidates would be chosen through Congress for the presidency and the vice presidency. And the assumption was that this is something that would happen with a fair amount of frequency, that they assumed that there would not be a majority all the time, and then the elected officials who knew how government worked would then choose the best candidate for president. Obviously, as it turned out, shortly after the Washington presidency, we had the rise of party democracy, and this became a much more politicized and partisan procedure. Another skepticism the framers of the Constitution had wasn't just in the knowledge base of the electorate, but also a skepticism just for direct democracy anyhow. If you look at the structure of the Constitution as it was originally written, the House of Representatives is in fact the only direct participation voters had in federal government. You vote for your local representative in your local district every 2 years. At the time, the Senate was elected by the local state legislatures. So you would vote for your state legislature, and they in turn would select the senator. So there was a buffer between the electorate and the senators. And likewise, for the presidency, you had this electoral college system as a buffer between the mass electorate and the government there. And then one other thing to bear in mind about how the Constitution set up the Electoral College. You'll recall that I mentioned that you don't have the right to vote directly for the president. In fact, you don't have the right to vote for president at all. And that's true. The Constitution provides that the state legislatures will actually set up the process by which each state will select their electors for president. This means that a state could theoretically have the state legislature choose the electors every 4 years, or assign it to the governor, or through some hybrid system. It doesn't have to be, as most states have done, a winner-take-all, where the person who wins the most votes in that state gets the full slate of electors. Nearly every state has that. The only exceptions, by the way, are Maine and Nebraska, which are too complicated to get into right now. Pretty much every state has a winner-take-all approach to the electors that they send to the Electoral College. And so it is a system that is very skeptical of direct participation. It is meant to be a buffer between the electorate and the federal government itself and the position of presidency. Because of the rise of the two-party system, the Electoral College has tended to become less important as time has gone on, simply because the parties who select the slate of electors will choose essentially party loyalists, people who are working for the party, who might be perhaps contributors, although you can't pay for that position, obviously, or people who just can't be trusted by the parties to vote the way they want to. So why is this unfair? Well, part of the unfairness, so to speak, is the fact that the minimum each state could have in terms of the number of electors is 3, based on 2 senators and 1 representative. So however small a state is, and the smallest state by population is Wyoming with just over 500,000 people, it will only ever have 3 electors. It will have no fewer, because you cannot take their senators away from them without them acquiescing in that. And so that's the bare minimum. Now, I chose Wyoming for a reason, which is that Wyoming, having only just over 500,000 people, is so much smaller than, say, the state of California, where California alone has about 15 or 16 counties that are larger than the state of Wyoming. And so despite that disparity, it still gets 2 plus however many representatives it has. And yes, it has a fair number of times more than Wyoming does. But if you break down the math, and I've seen this done in different ways, a vote in Wyoming for president counts about 2 to 3 times as much as a vote in California does. Again, depending on how you do the math. And so it's unfair that your vote counts more depending on where you live. Now, bear in mind, this is completely constitutional. This is how the Constitution is designed. It is designed to be a hybrid federal-state system where the different states have different levels of power. And so this was meant to protect small states by having this sort of senatorial and House of Representatives system, which then gets folded into the Electoral College. Another reason why people find it unfair is because they think that just not voting directly for the presidency just seems unfair, as well as not having a specific right to do so. So I think that is something that, for Americans and for fans of democracy itself, find that problematic at the very least. So why is it so difficult to maybe get rid of this system? Well, as unfair as it might be, it actually has some benefits. It has historically lent to a very stable democracy and a stable transition of power, because you can win an outright majority in the Electoral College without ever winning a majority of the popular vote. The best example of this is the most recent one, which is in 92 and 96, when Bill Clinton won election twice. Both times he never reached more than 50% of the vote, in the popular vote. But each time he had a majority in the Electoral College, which meant that his presidency was still legitimate. You could argue what mandate he had, but under the Constitution and in the popular consciousness, no one doubted that he had the right to become president. It's really only since 2000 that you've had a series of elections in which the winner is not the person who won the popular vote. Prior to that, almost always the winner of the popular vote also won the Electoral College. Part of this is because of demographics. Part of this is a partisan shift where a lot of states, particularly populous states, have become more one party or the other. There's a lot of different reasons for it, but certainly in the last 20 years, this has happened more and more frequently. Another reason why it's difficult to change the system is, what system do you change that to? The two main options have their own problems. For example, if you want the person who becomes president to have a majority of the popular vote, well, what happens when you have more than two candidates? You're likely to have to go to a runoff, which means that you're going to have a second election, perhaps. You could probably do an instant runoff where you have ranked choices, but then you have to work through what ranked choicing is and institute that change in how voting works, and that might prove problematic for people to understand. I believe New Zealand does some sort of ranked voting mechanism in their elections, and some other countries do as well. The other option would be to just have whoever gets more votes than anyone else become president, in which case you don't need to hit 50% plus one. You could win as long as you get more votes than anyone else. And again, the problem with that is, what happens if you have 3 or 4 or 5 viable candidates? If they are all roughly equivalent in terms of how many votes they get, you wind up in a situation where someone becomes president even though they have 26%, 27% of the vote, and the vast majority of the population wanted someone else. So again, you might have a runoff situation, or you might have a situation in which the legitimacy of the person becoming president is problematic. So to recap, the Electoral College is a group of 538 electors who every 4 years travel to their respective state capitals to vote for president and vice president of the United States. Each candidate for president and vice president needs 270 or more electors to become president or vice president. You don't have the right as Americans to vote directly for the electors. The state legislature set up that system. And trying to fix it might pose more problems than it solves. And there are benefits and some definite inherent unfairness to the Electoral College system. But it is the system we still have right now, and it's the system we're operating under this coming election day, next Tuesday in 2020. So when you see things about the Electoral College, at least now you have a better understanding, hopefully, of what the Electoral College is, why it's important, what the problems are, and how it might change in the future. Thank you so much for listening or watching this edition of Prose and Con Law. Again, please hit a subscribe button, hit a like button, leave a comment, leave a rating on iTunes or wherever you download the podcast from. And as always, you can follow us on Twitter at Prose and Con Law, email us at proseandconlaw@gmail.com. I've been John O'Connor. Thank you so much for listening and watching. Make sure you vote and stay tuned for the next edition of Prose and Con Law.